Excellent. And I think that I will give the floor straight to Astrid to present herself and her very interesting research on anabolic steroid use and brain health. Please, Astrid, the floor is yours.
Yeah, so thanks a lot for inviting me to have a talk on our research, sharing our research with this community. My research group has conducted research about different aspects of anabolic steroid use in male and female weightlifters since 2013, and I'll present some of these findings to you today. And here is a fairly recent picture of our research group. From the left, we have current PhD students, Morgan Scarf and Hans Christian Henriksen. And then there's a former member of the research group. And then we have Maria Gjerstad, that has been involved basically from the start in various aspects. And then we have senior researcher Ingrid Havnes, which is involved in treatment aspects of steroid use and dependence. And then there is myself. And here are the major focus area of our research. So we are trying to identify cognitive and psychological risk factors of steroid use and dependence. A major aim of our research is to map the long-term effects on brain health and on mental health. And we are also looking into other somatic effects of use, including cardiovascular effects and hormones and inflammatory markers from the blood, and how these biomarkers relate to brain health and behavior. And there's also one aspect of our research that focuses on treatment, which is Ingrid is PI on this study, and Hans Christian Henriksen is a PhD student. So they are conducting right now and very, very exciting intervention study where they test out if medical intervention will reduce side effects associated with stopping use in dependent steroid users and be a safer choice. Yeah, so, and here is a picture of where the research group is working. It's beautiful surroundings, old psychiatric hospital in Oslo. And I was, since I got more than an hour to talk about the research, I was like, oh, what should I put in there? But this is how I landed. I will first give you a brief background. It will not be very extensive, since I will assume that most people engaging in these seminars, that they kind of have kind of fairly good knowledge about steroid use, how it's used, and the hormone consequences of use. And then I'll take you to our findings that relates to steroid use and brain and cognitive effects. Another major topic of our research is to look into steroid dependence. So there will be a lot of findings related to that, also regarding social cognitive findings. And finally, I'll present some findings about steroid use among patients in treatment for substance use disorder. So I'll start with to put it in a historical perspective to kind of give you a little bit of perspective of why we are looking into this and why it's important. So testosterone was first isolated in the 1930s, and quickly thereafter, hundreds of synthetic androgens were produced. around the 1950s, it was picked up by elite athletes and bodybuilders that these hormones could lead to great improvement of muscle mass and athletic performance. So it started to kind of spread in those kind of elite sport environments, and were used in sport competition in the coming decades, also in the Olympics. But it was not until some decades later, the 1980s and maybe even the 1990s in Scandinavia, that steroid use spread to the more general population, or to gym clients that took anabolic steroid just because they wanted to get big. And this is also the main use of anabolic steroids today. So it's not longer elite athletes where it's most common to use steroids, but it's among gym clients that take these substances to improve muscular appearance. And with that being said, have in mind that these first, can you see my arrow? Yeah, good. So this first generation of steroid users starting in the mid-80s, early 90s, maybe being in their early 20s by then, they are only now reaching middle age. And we know that anabolic steroid use is associated with an adverse range of consequences. And some of these, and I would say that probably those that relates to brain and cognitive function, they are a bit more slowly progressing. So if that is the case, then it could be that the more severe consequences of that will be in the period that is still ahead of us. So it could be that in the coming years we will have an increasing number of older steroid users that would be in need of healthcare for brain and cognitive pathology. It could be like that. So I think that what we know today about the consequences on brain and cognition is probably only the top of the iceberg. And it's important that we will continue to follow this, to monitor this in the coming years. So when anabolic steroids are being used, when they take the hormone levels, testosterone levels go up, and many users, they have good experience about that. They feel good, they have more energy, they withstand more training. Sex drive is typically increased, and they have many experience better self-confidence. And in contrast, when they stop to use steroids, or when they go off cycle, their testosterone levels are suppressed. Many become temporarily hypogonadal, and they experience kind of the opposite pattern where of feelings of depression, energy levels go down, anxiety might increase, libido as well, and their self-esteem might be poorer. So this is sort of central mechanism to the development of dependence, where kind of these withdrawal symptoms, where they kind of fear these withdrawal symptoms, and then that they restart to use before, or they don't want to take the breaks in between. So it kind of triggers more continued use despite of adverse consequences. And I must say that we have experienced that when we try to recruit participants to studies where we want to have these users typically using steroids in cycles where they go completely off it's not so easy to get these kind of users anymore, as my experience is that more use it in a more continuous fashion these days. So, but when steroids are being used to increase muscle mass, high doses are administered and over longer periods of time. And the main aim of our research is to look at how such long-term high-dose use affect the brain, cognitive function, mental health, and what are the consequences of brain health in old age. So hopefully we will be able to monitor these increasing number of older steroid users that we will likely see in the coming years. So the consequences of anabolic steroids on the reproductive system and the endocrine system, they have been described fairly well, whereas fewer have studied the consequences on neurons, on brain health. But there has been more research about this lately, and there is now accumulating evidence that anabolic steroid use impact brain health. For instance, there are now several cell culture studies that have shown that different kinds of typically used anabolic steroids, they have neurotoxic effect, cause death to the nerve cells. They may cause less viability, reduced neuroplasticity, and also animal models and a couple of human models have shown that high-dose steroid use is associated with reduced memory and also impaired cognitive function on a broader range of cognitive domains. We also know that there are medical consequences associated with steroid use that might impact the brain health, for instance, hypogonadism and various cardiovascular effects. So one of our main goals is to investigate the long-term effects of steroid use on brain structure. And to do so, we need users of anabolic steroids. And we recruit users that have used more than 1 year of cumulative, that have exposure exceeding more than 1 year, since we are interested in the long-term effects. And we want to compare these with a group that are as similar as possible. So both age-wise, but we have chosen to match steroid users on the amount of heavy resistant training. So we have a weightlifting control group with no history of anabolic steroid use, but that are equally engaged with lifting heavy weights. All participants, they underwent MRI scanning of the brain. And now I will focus on the findings that relate to the gray matter, which is the tissue in darker gray in this picture that contains the neural cell bodies. And we compare the volumes of different brain regions and look at the thickness of the cerebral cortex surrounding the whole brain. So what we did find, this was one of the first publications coming out from our study, was that long-term steroid use was associated with smaller neuroanatomical volumes, smaller brain volumes, including total gray matter volume, cerebral cortical volume, which is the it's easier to see here, the layer surrounding here, smaller putamen, which is a large structure of the basal ganglia, and smaller corpus callosum, which is a white matter fiber bundle that are connecting the two hemispheres. And the findings, they could not be explained by the use of other drugs or the intracranial volume, which is the volume inside the cranium, where differences in intracranial volume could suggest that there would be differences in head size or brain size prior to AAS initiation, but that was not the case. And all the findings were in the same direction with smaller volumes among steroid users. The most profound findings were those of the larger volumes, including the total gray matter volume and cortical volume. And to me, that suggests that the impact on brain health, they are more general rather than very regional specific. Profound findings from this study is also the differences that in cortical thickness between steroid users and the weightlifting controls. So the steroid users, they had thinner cerebral cortex in widespread regions, and the findings are visualized on lateral and medial brain surfaces on both the left and the right hemisphere. And the blue color is where the cortex is significantly thinner in the steroid users. And the upper pictures, it's all steroid users compared to the weightlifting control group. And in the lower picture, it's those users with more than 10 years of exposure compared to the weightlifting control groups. And even if it's fewer participants in this comparison, which would mean that it's more difficult to get significant findings, the effects are seemingly more widespread upon longer duration of use. So we wanted to see whether these differences in structural brain volumes and cortical thickness, if they also were related to cognitive performance. And to test this, we wanted to test a broad spectrum of cognitive abilities. So we have, I think they were 2 to 3 hours in our lab doing different cognitive tasks. And then we grouped the different tasks into meaning cognitive constructs. So we mapped the function of 6 different cognitive domains: working memory, speed, learning and memory, fine motor speed, problem solving, and executive function. And when we compare steroid users to the weightlifting controls, adjusting for age and education, there were actually differences between the groups on all of these cognitive abilities. But I mean, it's likely that some of these findings are not related to the steroid exposure per se. But most findings were also fairly stable when we also include a measure of verbal IQ, which is supposed to be a measure of pre-morbid intelligence level, and a measure of drugs of abuse during the past six months. And in particular, it was on working memory, speed of processing, problem solving, and memory where the findings were most pronounced. But of course, even if we adjust for things in the statistical models, I think it's likely to think that there could be also pre-morbid differences in cognitive function. So it's not we don't blame the steroids for all of these differences. One thing that we also did was to compare just within the steroid using group, to compare those who had used steroids for less than 5 years to those who had used steroids for more than 10 years. And when we did so, it was in particular memory performance that was lower in those with a longer duration of use, and also a tendency to differences on working memory performance. Memory problem is also a side effect that many of the participants in our study report as a side effect of use, 36%. And actually more than half of those that have used steroids for more than 10 years. So it could seem as the memory problems could be related to the use of anabolic steroids, at least for longer, those who are used for longer period of time. So as I mentioned, steroid dependence is a particular focus of our research group. It has become clear that use of anabolic steroids may lead to dependence, and studies suggest that about 1 of 3 of those who start to use steroids will develop dependency towards it. And they are a vulnerable group in many ways, as is also a trait of dependence, that they are those who kind of experience the most side effects of use, but are continuing to use even if it has clearly impact on their life. So we are trying to look at characteristic traits or risk factors that put people at risk for developing steroid dependence. So 3 different pathways has been suggested that may lead to steroid dependence from the literature. One is the body image pathway, where users may become dependent upon the anabolic properties of testosterone. So we know that body image disturbances is a risk factor of starting to use anabolic steroids, and it's thought that the anabolic effect might further trigger these disturbances and might lead to a fear of stopping to use steroids because fear of losing muscles. So it's a bit more of a psychological mechanisms that clearly differ from other drugs of abuse. Another suggested pathway is this endocrine pathway, where symptoms of hypogonadism upon stopping use the withdrawal symptoms will trigger further use to kind of avoid experience these dysphoric effects. And a third suggested mechanism is through reward mechanisms. So anabolic steroids differ from other drugs of other dependencies to other drugs of abuse, in that they do not produce this immediate rewarding effect, but many users still kind of describe a rewarding feeling when they are, particularly when they are using. They have this feel-good feeling. They describe being in a bubble, and many describe a feeling of that they're invincible in a way. There's also evidence from animal studies that rodents, they self-administer anabolic steroids, some actually until they drop dead. So there is some rewarding aspects to it, and there's several studies now that have shown that brain reward regions are implicated in these reward aspects. So we wanted to test if there were structural brain characteristics of anabolic steroid dependence. And to investigate this, we simply compared dependent steroid users to non-dependent users to compare their brain scans. And what we found was that the dependent steroid users, they had thinner cerebral cortex in several regions, both in frontal regions of the brain, in occipital regions in the back of the brain, and in temporal regions, and also in parietal regions. So it's kind of widespread across the brain, but some of the more profound findings that also were stable when we adjusted for the use of other drugs were these prefrontal effects of use. And I will pay a little bit attention to them because we know that these prefrontal regions, they are implicated in impulse control and emotion regulation. And thinner cortex in these regions have also been found in other dependencies. So it's a little bit tempting to speculate that thinner cortex in these regions could be linked with this maladaptive behavior of continued use despite of adverse consequences of use. And also linked to the prefrontal function of the prefrontal cortex is executive functions. So we wanted to test whether steroid dependence were related to deficits in executive functions. And in this study, we compared dependent steroid users to non-dependent and also to weightlifting controls. And executive functions, I didn't explain what that was. Executive functions are very central cognitive complex cognitive abilities that are subserved by the prefrontal cortex. And they are very important in order to, they help us getting things done and to regulate our behavior. So it could be working memory, impulse control, cognitive flexibility. So they are kind of very important in the control of our behavior. And we measured these executive function both with neurocognitive tests in the laboratory. We measured them with self-report measures of executive function in the daily life using the brief A. And we measured it with, we included measures of ADHD symptoms. ADHD is executive dysfunction is seen in several psychiatric disorders, in particularly in ADHD and also with substance misuse. And we also included measures of psychological distress, anxiety, and depression. So on the cognitive function, we found that the dependent steroid users, they actually performed worse on all of these executive tasks: problem solving, working memory, mental flexibility, and inhibition, where the non-dependent users, they they were somewhere in between. And on executive functioning in the daily life, it's the brief A. These scales have been really heightened in substance use disorder, for instance. So, and also in our sample, we saw that the dependent users, they self-reported more executive problems on almost all of these scales. They had also more ADHD symptoms than compared to non-using weightlifters, whereas the non-dependent users, they were not different from the controls. And they also had more psychological distress, higher levels of anxiety and depression. It should be noted that these ADHD scores, they are very few score above the clinical level. So these are subclinical levels, but still clear differences between the dependent users and the control group. Yeah, so I moved to social cognitive abilities. In a series of studies, we also looked into the social cognitive abilities related to use of AAS and dependence. And maybe even more than cognitive, classical cognitive tasks, the social cognitive abilities is even more, maybe more impact on your life, as it is great related to social communication and interpersonal relations. And there's a lot of different social cognitive abilities, and we wanted to test some of these social cognitive abilities in the steroid users. And we have used 3 different laboratory tasks to evaluate social cognitive abilities. 2 with mapping emotion recognition. 1 that where the participants will identify emotions from body movement. And in that test, EMOBIO task, the participants, they will show 22 video clips, short video clips of, it's an actress that has point light attached to its joints, and that are moving in the dark and are kind of acting different emotions, and then the participants will kind of based upon very little visual input identify the correct emotion from these body movements. And then there is a more classical test that we have used, which is identification of emotions through facial expression, where the facial expressions are presented on the video now on a computer screen for a brief time, and then the participants will have to choose which emotion that was briefly shown. And another task that we have used, which was very time-consuming to do, but it is supposed to be high ecological validity task, was a task of more perspective taking or theory of mind, the ability of inferring the mental states of others, taking others' perspective. And this task, it lasts for nearly 40 minutes. Participants will see a video film of where these 4 persons are featuring and it's a social Friday night evening social interaction theme, where the film is stopped several times midway, and the participants have to choose between different alternatives, what the people in the movie are feeling or thinking at the time when it stopped. So I think it's relevant to look at social cognitive abilities, because as impaired social cognitive abilities have been seen with other substance dependencies. It has been impaired for several psychiatric disorders. And what is also interesting is that there is a lot of evidence showing that testosterone could have influence some social cognitive abilities. So they have seen both that endogenous testosterone level might predict how good you are at this identifying emotion in facial expressions, and that low doses of testosterone given to females, that it both changes the brain activation pathway in amygdala and in pathways associated with involved in emotion recognition, and that it can also lead to impaired behavior. So it's interesting of several reasons to look at social cognitive abilities. These two tasks, the MOBO, were emotion recognition from body movement, and the theory of mind task, the video film, they were from the first investigation where we had, and at that time we did not have access to hormone levels, and it was part of the thesis work of Lisa Evju-Hauger, and she was really into steroid dependence. So in this task we compared non-using weightlifters to non-dependent and to dependent steroid users. And on both these social cognitive tasks, we found that the dependent steroid users, they performed lower on the overall score and this emotion recognition on fearful emotions. They were poorer recognizing that, and they were also had reduced theory of mind abilities compared to the non-using weightlifters, both on content that was more cognitive related, related to inferring their thoughts and to inferring their emotions. So it was dependent steroid users that performed lower, no differences between non-dependent users and weightlifting controls. And we also, even if we didn't have the hormones, we did do comparison of users being on and off cycle, and it didn't have any impact on the findings. So we didn't find any impact on hormone fluctuations, it seems. However, 3.5 years later, we included this more classical motion recognition task of facial expressions. And at this time point, we did have access to hormone levels. And it was also on this type of task that the previous findings that I showed you from other studies, where they have seen that testosterone level could impact the ability to recognize emotional facial expressions. And actually that was what we found here also, that whereas the steroid users off cycle, they were not different from the weightlifting control group, but on cycle users performed lower on this ability to recognize facial emotions in facial expressions. And in particular, it was seen for anger, disgust, and for fear, whereas it performed perfectly well for happiness, sadness, and surprise. And what was interesting was also that we saw, not very strong, but we found some correlations with hormone levels and also with the testosterone to epitestosterone levels in the urine that are elevated when people are taking testosterone. So there was some correlations here on typically on two of those emotions that are impaired on cycle, where elevations in testosterone levels and the free androgen index that are typically elevated by the use of steroids were associated with worse performance on these tasks. And there was also positive correlations with these pituitary hormones, FSH and LH, that are typically suppressed by the use of steroids. So it was a little bit interesting. We thought that we also found that temporary effect of steroid use on emotional processing, where these hormonal perturbations caused by high dose steroid use may impair the ability to recognize emotional phases. So it's not published yet, but hopefully within this year or the next. So summary on the social cognitive findings. We have seen that steroid dependence show impaired emotional recognition from body movement, fear in particular, and impaired theory of mind. And on emotional facial recognition, it was lower in users on cycle, suggesting temporary effect of steroid use on emotional processing. We have started to follow our sample longitudinally with two major data collections so far. In total, 140 unique steroid users and 110 weightlifting controls have participated in these studies. So we have longitudinal data on some of these measures. And on the second time point, we extended our exploration to include other departments of the hospital to also do thorough cardiac examination, blood vessel examination, and we have these biomarkers in blood, the hormones and the inflammatory markers. So it's several collaboration partners included, and it's turned out to be very interdisciplinary, which I like very much. And based upon the neuroimaging data from both of these investigations, we estimated the biological brain age of our participants. And to do so, in the first step, we trained a model using approximately 2,000 brain scans from healthy male participants. So a model was trained to learn to know how a typical brain looks at a particular age. And then we use this model to our participants, where they will have no information about chronological age, but the model will, based upon the brain characteristics, guess the biological brain age of each participant. And the differences between the biological brain age and the chronological brain age is the brain age gap, and it can tell you if the aging trajectories are deviant from the population norm. And what we found here was that compared to the weightlifting control group, the steroid users had older appearing brains, higher than expected brain age, both for the total brain age measure and also for regional measures that I haven't shown here. And the data is based upon scan from 133 steroid users and 99 weightlifting control. So it's by far the largest neuroimaging data study to date. We also have longitudinal data on some of these participants. And so we had a possibility to see if the brain age gap would increase from one time point to the next 3.5 year apart. And in the main model, there were no evidence of significant increase in brain age gap for the steroid using groups. But it was seen with steroid users that have used steroids for more than 10 years, then there was also an increasing brain age gap, and it was seen in dependent steroid users. So accelerated brain aging was seen with longer steroid exposure and with dependence. These brain age measures is kind of a useful tool also when we are trying to disentangle what are causing the brain effects, because you get a lot of information that is compromised into one single measure or to a few meaningful measures, because you have the regional brain age as well. But the full brain age gap is kind of a compromised measure of a lot of information. And there's likely several consequences related to steroid use somatic effects that might be associated with the brain age findings. And the cardiovascular effects is certainly one. We know that the cardiovascular effects is very linked to brain health. So we wanted to see how the cardiac findings from our sample from 101 steroid users were linked to the brain age findings. So I will not provide you details about the echocardiographic examination or the details of the findings, but they are pretty similar to consistent with what has been shown in the literature so far, where steroid use is associated with left ventricular hypertrophy, or actually biventricular hypertrophy, with thicker mean wall thickness and greater mass, and reduced systolic function. And I picked out two measures central for systolic function: ejection fraction and global longitudinal strain, which tells you something about the heart's ability to contract and to pump out blood with each heartbeat. So actually all of these measures of cardiac structure and function were to some extent related to the brain age findings. The correlations were all weak to moderate character. You can see the correlations here, but clearly significant. And you can see that it's the steroid using group in orange that are primarily driving these correlations. Yeah, so not very strong correlations, but they seem to be related to the brain age finding to some extent, and probably there's several factors contributing. Yeah, so the prevalence of steroid use it's very variable in different populations, and most studies suggest that whereas between 2 and 3% of the general population have sometimes some experience with anabolic steroid use, the prevalence is much higher among recreational sports people, where about studies have shown that between 8 and 18% have used anabolic steroid at some point, and is kind of high among bodybuilders. Our research group conducted a study among patients in treatment for substance use disorder to see how the prevalence rate were there, how many that have experience with anabolic steroids. And actually 30% of patients in treatment for SUD patients, treatment for substance use disorder, had experience with anabolic steroids. There are 36% of the male patients and 8% of the female patients. And among these patients in SUD treatment, steroid use was most prevalent among men with illegal substance use, where 50% had experience with anabolic steroids, and a bit lower among those that were treated for alcohol use disorder, but still kind of a fairly high level. And data from this study is from 563 SUD patients, and they are from 38 treatment facilities in Norway. And I just want to also mention that there could be different motives to why steroids are being used. And in this particular population, nearly half reported that they had initiated steroid use to overcome because the psychoactive substance use have made them meager. So I think it's interesting to monitor the use of steroids in this type of population also. We also looked at steroid dependence among these substance use patients. And this is a recently published study by my PhD student, Morgan Scarth. And she's very skilled with the statistical methods. And in this study, we wanted to see if we could go use our data and go beyond this economist categorization of steroid dependence, where you either are dependent or not. Maybe the data are not so good because this is questionnaire data, but we wanted to see it was kind of a large amount that have used anabolic steroids. So we performed a latent class analysis to see if there were patterns in.
That steht auf der Website. Auf der Website ist
Sorry?
Sorry for that. That was from one of our participants, but it's muted now.
Okay, it's not a question to me, or?
No.
Okay. Yeah. So,
I think not, but yeah.
okay, just tell me. Yeah. This is, so we run a latent class analysis to see if there were patterns on how different groups experience these symptoms of steroid dependence. And these were the symptoms that contributed to to the model. And this is the pattern of how it was distributed, with ending up with 3 different groups, largely reflecting different levels of steroid dependence, where there was one group that experienced hardly had any symptoms at all, so they were clearly not dependent upon steroids. They had only typically used steroid once or twice. And then you had one group that experienced moderate symptoms. Some symptoms were present, in particular that they used larger amount than was intended. And then there was one group that experienced all of these symptoms in dark gray to kind of high extent. And then we wanted to see how these different level of dependent severity were related to executive function and personality pathology. So here are, again, we used the brief A to as a measure of executive function in daily life. And here are the distribution of the executive function scores for the different scales, where the black dot is the mean of each group, and where you have the light blue bar, which is SUD patients that have no experience with anabolic steroids, and then you have the low symptoms group in blue, followed by the moderate and the high symptoms group. What we found was that inhibition, emotional inhibition, emotional control, and self-monitor was in particular related to higher levels of steroid dependence. In a regression analysis, trying to find the best predictors of more severity, severe steroid dependence, it was emotional control and self-monitor that were the best predictors. I think it was even more clear when we looked at personality pathology that we used the PED-5 short form and 2 scales from the CIP 118 to measure personality pathology. And you can see that a lot of these personality pathology scales are elevated among these with higher levels of steroid dependence. And I think it's a little bit interesting because these are patients that are not in treatment for the steroid use, they are in treatment for the use of other substances. And we do not think that it's the steroid use per se that have that make them score higher on this, express more personality pathology, but it seems to be some personality differences to those SUD patients that start to use anabolic steroids and become dependent upon it. And in particular, it was negative affectivity, antagonism, which is similar to antisocial personality traits, disinhibition, and psychoticism, and also rigid perfectionism that was associated with severe dependence, where antagonism and rigid perfectionism were the best predictors of severe dependence. And I think it's a little bit interesting, this rigid perfectionism thing also, because it's a trait that also have been found in eating disorders. So So to sum up these, the main findings from the SUD patients, we have found that a high lifetime prevalence of steroid use among patients in treatment for substance use disorder. And we have seen that high steroid dependence is associated with poor self-monitoring and emotional control and more personality pathology. It was antagonism that was the strongest predictor of high dependency symptoms. So this antisocial, more callous traits, that were particularly linked to higher steroid dependence. And we suggest, I didn't show that now, but we also found that those scoring higher on steroid dependence, they initiated drug use earlier. They had a earlier WH also regarding to anabolic steroids. They use more substances and they express more pathology. So I think it's good to have to pay attention to this, because it seems like steroid use and severe dependence could be a potential marker of more severe pathology in general in this population, and meaning that they could be more difficult to treat also, because that is antisocial personality and stuff have pretty poor treatment outcome. So it could be that some what it's specific treatment is needed to these kind of groups. Here I try to make a figure that summarizes traits or personality traits or the characteristics that we have found to be related to steroid dependence among our two groups of that we have investigated. So we have seen that steroid dependence is associated with more executive deficits, lower social cognitive abilities, higher level of ADHD symptoms, thinner prefrontal cortex, and accelerated brain aging, higher level of anxiety and depression, and in certain patients, more personality pathology, and aggression, and also more higher but I didn't present the aggression findings now, but we've seen that in another study which has been published. And I think it's important we are not trying to say that this is caused by the anabolic steroids. I think it's more likely that some of these traits could be early predictors or pose as a vulnerability factor, or why some are prone to become dependent upon anabolic steroids. And it could be that some of these are also exaggerated by use. For instance, the findings of thinner prefrontal cortex. I think that could be a consequence of long-term high dose use that again will kind of exaggerate addictive behavior. Yeah. And to sum it all up, we have seen that long-term high-dose steroid use is associated with higher than expected brain age and lower cognitive performance. And we have seen that steroid dependence in particular is associated with thinner prefrontal cortices and executive deficits. It has also been associated with social cognitive abilities, at least on two of the tasks that we have investigated, and personality pathology among these SUD patients. And it's also important to note that on most of these measures, the non-dependent users, they are not that different from weightlifting controls. Sometimes they are in between, but in most cases, they are not significantly different from weightlifting controls. And we have also seen some evidence that high-dose steroid use seem to temporarily impact emotion recognition. So I want to thank you all for attending, and of course for all the participants that have been participating in these studies, because we tend to require a lot of them. We are testing them for several hours, and we are doing the brain scans and the cardiac examination, and we draw blood for them. Not always that pleasant. And big thanks to the steroid anabolic steroid research group, which is very fun to work together with, and the cardiologists Vibeke Almås and Ranj Abdullah, which is also a member of the steroid using group, the AS research group, that have done the cardiac examination, and the brain age prediction were done by our collaborators that are really intelligent and do all this kind of big data analysis and machine learning thing. And I will also mention in particular that Lisa Hauger and Morgan Scarf, they are both writing their paper. Lisa is a former member that have written her PhD on steroid dependence, and Morgan Scarf is doing working with this at the moment. So thanks.